31 years. That is how long I had been gone from the town where I was born, and that is how long it took for a single sheet of paper to find its way back into my hands and tell me that everything I thought I had lost had been waiting for me the whole time. My name is Della Hartwell, and I was 55 years old the autumn I came back to Marrow Creek to bury my grandfather, with no expectation of inheriting anything but the cost of his funeral and the weight of the years I had spent away. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. I had left at 24 after a fight I could no longer remember the exact words of, only the temperature of it. The way the kitchen had gone cold and stayed cold, and I had not spoken to him in the 3 decades since. He died on a Thursday in October, alone in the house he had built before I was born, and the lawyer who called me said the old man had asked, in writing, that I be the one to clear the house out. Not my cousins, not the church, me, the woman who had not sent so much as a Christmas card since the year Reagan left office. I want you to understand the kind of years those were, the 31 of them, because the years are the whole story, and the Cidery is just where they finally came to rest. I had been a girl who sang. That is the part nobody who knows me now would believe, because I have a voice like a gravel road these days, and I do not sing in front of anyone. But at 22, I had a voice that could fill the little Methodist church on Bell Street and make the old women cry into their handkerchiefs. My grandfather, Asa Hartwell, played the organ there for 40 years. He was the choir director and the organist and the man who locked up after Wednesday practice, and he had raised me from the time I was 9. After the influenza took my mother one bad February, and my father simply did not come back from the place his grief took him to. Asa raised me in that house with the wraparound porch on Sumner Road, and he taught me to read music before he taught me to read words, and the two of us were a duet for 15 years. Then I turned 24, and I wanted to go to the city and study at the conservatory, and he wanted me to stay and take over the choir, and we said things to each other that 2 stubborn people say when they each believe they are protecting the other from a mistake. I went. He let me go without a word, which at the time I read as permission and later understood as fury. I did not get into the conservatory. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where the prodigal returns triumphant is not the version I lived. I waited tables. I sang in a wedding band for a while, and then in a worse wedding band. And then I stopped singing because the auditions stopped going anywhere, and a person can only be told she is almost good enough so many times before she decides to be something else entirely. I married a man named Carl who managed a tire distributorship, and Carl was not unkind, but he was not anything else either. And after 11 years he left for a woman who worked the front desk at his dentist's office. I kept the apartment and the cat and a job doing the books for a heating and cooling company, and I told myself that was a life, and in most of the ways that count it was. But I never called Asa. Pride is a strange architecture. You build a wall 1 brick of silence at a time, and then one day the wall is taller than you are, and you cannot remember laying the first brick. Only that climbing back over it now would mean admitting you had built the wrong thing. So when the lawyer called, a man named Pruitt with a slow, careful way of talking, and told me Asa Hartwell had died and left instructions, I sat in my kitchen in the city for a long time with the phone pressed to my ear and said nothing, because there was nothing in me prepared to be summoned back across 31 years by a dead man's request. I had imagined his death the way you imagine a storm you have decided will never actually reach your county. And now it had reached me, and the strange small cruelty of it was that he had reached out first, in death, in a way he never had in life, and I would never be able to ask him why he had waited so long, or why he had waited at all. The drive to Marrow Creek took 6 hours. I had not made it in 31 years, and the road had been widened in places and rerouted in others, but the last 20 miles were exactly as I remembered them. The way the land folds down into the creek valley and the orchards begin, the apple country that the town had been built on back when apples were a thing a family could live on. There were fewer orchards now. I could see that even from the highway, the old rows gone ragged or plowed under for soybeans. The packing sheds collapsed in on themselves like animals that had lain down to die. Marrow Creek had been a town of 3,000 when I left, and the sign at the edge said it was a town of 1,800 now, and the difference was visible in every shuttered storefront on the main street. The hardware store gone, the dress shop gone, the second of the 2 churches now an antique mall, and then, judging by the soaked windows, not even that anymore. The house on Sumner Road was smaller than it lived in my memory. Houses always are. It was a two-story farmhouse, white once and now the gray of a thing that has gone unpainted through too many winters, with the wraparound porch sagging at the southeast corner where a post had rotted through. Asa had built it himself in 1958, framed it with his brother, and roofed it with men from the church, and it had been a proud thing once. The yard had gone to seed. A crab apple by the steps had grown wild and was pressing its branches against the siding the way an animal leans on a fence. I parked in the gravel and I sat there with the engine ticking as it cooled, and I did not want to go in, and I made myself go in. Pruitt had left the key under the mat, which told me everything about the kind of town Marrow Creek still was, that a lawyer would leave a dead man's house key under the mat and trust that the only person who would come for it was the one it was meant for. The lock was stiff. Inside, the air had the particular stillness of a house where someone has recently stopped living. Not yet the must of true abandonment, but something on its way there. The smell of cold coffee, and old paper, and a faint sweetness underneath that I could not place at first, and then realized was apples. There was a bowl of them on the kitchen table, gone soft. The last apples Asa had picked from whatever tree was still bearing in the yard, set out the way he had always set them out, and nobody had thrown them away because nobody had been in the house since the morning the neighbor found him. I want to tell you that I felt grief in that moment, clean and simple, but I did not. What I felt was the strangeness of a room that had kept living its small habits after the man who made them was gone. His reading glasses were folded on the arm of the chair by the window. A cardigan hung on the hook by the back door. The kitchen calendar was turned to October, and 3 days into October someone, Asa, had written in his small, careful hand the word choir and a time, 6:30, an appointment he had not lived to keep. He had still been directing the choir. At 86 years old, he had still been climbing the steps to the loft on Wednesday nights, and I had not known that, because I had not known anything about his life for 31 years, and the weight of all that not knowing came down on me there in the kitchen with the soft apples, and I sat down in his chair by the window, and I put my face in my hands. The funeral was on Saturday. I will not spend long on it, because the discovery is what you came for, and I promise we are getting there. But you need to know who was in that church, because they come back into the story later, and the way they looked at me that day is the measure of how far I had to climb. The little Methodist church on Bell Street was half full, which for a town of 1,800 and a man of 86 was a good showing, and most of the faces were old and most of them I half remembered. My cousin Royce was there. Royce is the son of Asa's brother, my great-uncle, and Royce had stayed in Marrow Creek his whole life, and Royce had spent the last decade, I would learn, positioning himself as the natural heir to whatever Asa had, on the grounds that he was the one who had stayed, the one who had driven the old man to his appointments and mowed his yard the summers he could not, and there was a truth in that I could not deny and would not try to. Royce came up to me at the reception in the church basement, the folding tables and the urn of weak coffee and the ladies of the auxiliary laying out a spread of casseroles, and he took my hand in both of his and told me how sorry he was, and then he said, with the smile of a man laying down a card he believes is the high one, "It's a shame you couldn't make it back while he was still with us. He asked about you, you know, right up to the end." He let that sit. Then he said, "The house is going to be a project. All that clearing out. I told Pruitt I'd be glad to handle the whole thing. Take it off your hands. You living so far. No sense you driving back and forth." And I understood, standing there with a paper cup of coffee in the basement of the church where I had once sung loud enough to make old women weep, that my cousin Royce wanted the house, and that he had wanted it for a long time, and that he had assumed, the way everyone in that basement had assumed, that the woman who had stayed away for 31 years had no claim on anything and no business pretending otherwise. I told Royce I would think about it. I did not tell him that Pruitt had already read me the will, 3 days before, and that Asa had left the house and its contents and the 11 acres it sat on to me, and only to me, with a line in his own hand that Pruitt had read aloud in a voice that caught, to my granddaughter Della, who has the better ear of anyone I ever taught, and who will know what to listen for when the time comes. I had not understood that line. I do not think Pruitt understood it either. He had folded the will and looked at me over his glasses and said only that the old man had insisted on that exact wording, had made him write it down twice to get it right, and that he, Pruitt, had assumed it was the sentiment of a man going soft at the end. I had assumed the same. I would learn otherwise, but not yet. That night I slept in the house, in my old room. which Asa had not changed in 31 years. The same iron bed, the same water-stained wallpaper with the faded yellow roses, a shelf of my old books and a few of my old records, and on the wall, framed, a photograph I had forgotten existed, of me at maybe 20 in a choir robe, mouth open mid-note, and Asa beside me at the organ with his head turned to watch me sing, and on his face an expression I had never once seen while I was looking at him, only now, in a photograph, 35 years too late, pure, undisguised pride. He had kept that on the wall of my empty room for 31 years. I took it down and I held it, and I did not sleep much. I started clearing the house on Sunday. I did it the slow way, room by room, because there was no one to help me and because, I think, I was not in a hurry to finish the last thing I would ever do for him. The house was full in the way the houses of old people are full, every drawer a sediment of decades, and I worked through it methodically, a box for keeping and a box for the church sale and a box for the dump, and I found the ordinary archaeology of a life. His army discharge papers, a cigar box of buttons, receipts going back to the 70s, rubber-banded by year. Hymnals, a great many hymnals, because he was a church organist and they had accumulated around him the way tools accumulate around a carpenter, and I set them all in a box for the church without opening them, because what is there to find in a hymnal but hymns? Except, on the Tuesday, in the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk in the front room, the desk where he had paid his bills and written his choir programs for half a century, I found one more hymnal, and this one was not with the others. It was wrapped in a clean dish towel, and it was set apart, alone in the drawer, the way you set apart a thing that matters from the things that merely are. It was an old one, the cloth cover worn soft and the gilt gone from the title, Cokesbury Worship Hymnal, and when I picked it up it was heavier on one side than a book should be, the way a book is heavy when something has been put inside it. I unwrapped the towel. I opened the cover. Folded into the front of that hymnal, pressed flat by the weight of decades, was a single sheet of heavy paper, yellowed and soft at the creases, and I knew before I unfolded it that it was old, the kind of old that paper gets when it has been folded the same way for a very long time. I unfolded it on the desk under the lamp. It was a deed. A property deed, the formal kind, with the county seal embossed at the top and the spidery copperplate of an old courthouse clerk filling in the blanks, and it conveyed, I read, to A. Hartwell, the parcel and all structures thereon known as the Hartwell Cider Works, situated on the old Vinton Road, being 22 acres more or less, recorded in the county registry in the year 1961. I read it 3 times. A cidery. My grandfather had owned a cidery, 22 acres on the old Vinton Road, and in 31 years of growing up in his house and 55 years of being alive, I had never once heard him mention it. I knew Asa as a church organist and a man who kept a few apple trees in the yard the way everyone in apple country did. I did not know him as a man who had owned a working cider operation on 22 acres. The deed was dated 1961, 3 years after he built the house. And there was something else, tucked behind the deed in the fold of the hymnal, a smaller piece of paper, and this one was not old at all. It was a sheet from a yellow legal pad, and it was covered in Ace's handwriting, the same small, careful hand from the calendar, and the ink was not faded. He had written it recently. He had written it, I would understand, knowing he was near the end, and he had folded it into the hymnal with the deed and wrapped the whole thing in a clean dish towel and set it apart in the drawer where he knew that I, clearing out his house, would eventually find it. I did not read the note right away. My hands were not steady and the lamp seemed suddenly too dim, and I had the disorienting sense that the house had rearranged itself around me, that the man I had spent 31 years being angry at had been a different man than the one I was angry at, and I needed a moment before I could let him speak to me from the page. So I set the note down and I looked at the deed again, the old Vinton Road, and I tried to remember where that was, and slowly it came to me. A road on the far side of the creek that we had driven sometimes when I was small, a road that went up into the hills where the orchards had been the oldest and the best, and I had a sudden flickering memory, so faint I could not be sure it was real, of being a very young child in the cab of Ace's truck on that road, and the smell of apples so strong it was almost a color, and my grandfather singing. When I could, I picked up the note and I read it. Della, it began, and just my name in his hand undid something in me. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have come home to clear the house. which means you got my message even though I never had the courage to send you one any other way. I have a great deal to be sorry for and not enough paper to be sorry on. So I will be sorry for the main thing, which is that I let you go in silence, and then I let the silence harden, and every year I told myself I would write to you, and every year I did not, because I am a coward in exactly one direction, and that direction is you. I have followed your life as best I could from a distance. I know about the band, and I know about the man who left, and I know you stopped singing. And that last one is the thing I cannot forgive myself, because I think I am part of why I had to stop. I want to be honest with you about how hard this part was, because I sat in that chair, and I wept the way I had not wept at the funeral, the way I had not wept in years, the deep, ugly kind that comes up from somewhere below the floor of you. He had known. He had followed it all. Across 31 years of silence he had been watching, somehow, the way you watch a weather system you cannot stop, and he had grieved the loss of my voice as his own fault, and he had never said a word, and now he was saying all of it at once from the far side of the only thing that cannot be taken back. I let myself cry until I was empty, and then I read the rest, because he was not finished, and what he had left me was not only an apology. There is a place, the note went on, that I never told you about, and I should have, and the not telling is its own long story I do not have room for. The Cidery on the Vinton Road was my father's and his father's before him. It was the Hartwell place before the church, before the organ, before any of it. We made cider there for 60 years, and it was the best in 3 counties, and I worked it as a boy with hands that smelled of apples until October. I closed it the year your mother died. I could not run it and raise you both at once, and your mother's care had cost what it cost, and I made a choice, and the choice was you. I shut the gates and I let the orchard go, and I never spoke of it again, because to speak of it was to count what it cost, and I did not want you ever to feel you were a thing that had cost me something. You were never a cost, Della. You were the reason. But I never finished the work I started out there, and I never let go of it either. And what is on that land is yours now, and you of all people will know what to listen for. Go and see. Take the key from the bottom of this drawer. The big one. You will know the lock when you find it. That was the note. I read the last lines 3 times. You of all people will know what to listen for. The same strange phrase from the will, and I understood now that it had not been a sentimental flourish, that the old man had meant it as an instruction, that there was something at the cidery he wanted me specifically to find, and that he believed I had the ear for it. I reached into the bottom of the drawer and felt around in the back corner, behind a tray of pen nibs and dried-out ink bottles, and my fingers closed on a key. It was an old iron key, long and heavy, the kind made for a lock that no longer comes from any hardware store, with a head shaped like a clover and a shaft worn smooth by a century of hands. The Hartwell key. I held it in my palm, and it was cold, and then, slowly, it was warm from my hand, and I sat in my dead grandfather's chair in the lamplight with a deed in front of me, and an iron key in my fist, and a note that had broken open 31 years of certainty about who he had been and what he had felt, and I knew that in the morning I was going to drive out the old Vinton Road and find a cidery that no one in town had mentioned, that no one perhaps even remembered, and see what my grandfather had left for me to hear. I slept badly and woke before light. I made coffee in his percolator, the only kind of coffee that house knew how to make, and I drank it on the sagging porch and watched the sky go from black to the gray of a thing thinking about changing. And I tried to make a plan and could not, because I did not have enough information to plan, only a deed and a key and a feeling. I am not a woman given to feelings of destiny. I had spent 30 years doing the books for a heating and cooling company precisely because I trust ledgers more than feelings. But that morning on the porch, I felt the years gathering behind me like water behind a dam, all 31 of them, and I understood that whatever was out on the Vinton Road, I was not going to be able to treat it the way I had treated everything else, at arm's length, with a wall of silence between me and the cost of caring. The wall was already coming down. He had taken the first brick out himself, with a note folded in a hymnal, and the rest was coming down whether I was ready or not. Before I left, I did one thing. I called Pruitt, the lawyer, because I am careful by nature, and because 30 years of bookkeeping had taught me that a thing you have not documented is a thing you do not really have. I asked him whether he knew about a property on the Vinton Road, a cidery, 22 acres, deeded to Asa in 1961. There was a long pause on the line, the kind of pause a careful man takes when he is deciding how surprised to admit he is. Then Pruitt said, slowly, that he had drawn up Ace's estate documents himself, that he had inventoried everything he knew the old man to own, and that there had been no cidery on any list he had ever seen. The house, the 11 acres it sat on, a modest amount in the bank, a paid-off truck. Nothing on the Vinton Road. As far as the county and the estate were concerned, Pruitt said, that property did not exist. And then he said the thing that made the hair stand up on my arms. He said that if there was a 1961 deed in Ace's hand, and it had never been part of any later transaction, then it was possible, even likely, that the property had simply fallen off the book somewhere in the intervening 60 years, that the taxes had gone unpaid or the records had gone uncomputerized and lost, and that what I was holding was either a piece of paper worth nothing at all, or the only proof in existence that 22 acres in Apple Country belonged to the Hartwell family. He could not tell me which until I went and looked, and until he went to the courthouse and pulled what he could find. Go careful, he said, and let me know what's actually out there before you tell anyone else. Especially, he added, after a beat, before you tell Royce. I put the deed and the note in my bag. I put the iron key in my coat pocket where I could feel its weight against my hip. And I got in the car and I drove down off Sumner Road and through the dying Main Street and across the bridge over Marrow Creek, low and brown in its autumn channel, and up the far side of the valley toward the hills where the oldest orchards had been, following the old Vinton Road as it narrowed from blacktop to chip seal to gravel, the trees crowding in on both sides, the morning mist still lying in the low places. And I drove with the deed beside me and the key against my hip and 31 years coming down behind me brick by brick toward a thing my grandfather had loved and buried and saved, all of it, for me. The gate was where the deed said it would be, though I almost drove past it. The old Vinton Road had gone fully to gravel by then, and the orchards on either side had reverted to something that was no longer orchard and not quite woods, the apple trees still there in their old rows but grown wild and tangled with sumac and wild grape, so that you had to know what you were looking at to see that this had ever been planted by human hands. The gate itself was iron, 2 leaves of it sagging on stone posts, and across it someone had long ago run a length of logging chain and a padlock, and the whole thing was so overgrown with bittersweet that I had walked right up to it before I understood it was a gate at all and not just a thicker part of the thicket. There was a sign, or had been. I could make out, under the rust and the vines, the ghost of carved letters on a board nailed to the post, and when I pulled the bittersweet away the letters resolved into Hartwell Cider Works, and below that, smaller, SD 1899. I stood there with my hand on the cold iron, and I felt the years again, all of them, but differently now, because I was standing on the actual ground of the thing my grandfather had buried, and the ground does not lie the way memory does. This had been real. 1899. 3 generations of Hartwells had worked this place, and the last of them had shut the gate the year my mother died, and walked away and raised me instead, and had never once let me know that the trade existed, that I had been chosen over a 60-year-old family business, that I was, in the only language that mattered to a man like Asa, the more valuable of the two. The padlock was old and the logging chain was rusted nearly through, and I did not need the iron key for the gate after all. The chain came apart in my hands with one good pull, the rust giving way like rotten thread. I pushed the gate open against the resistance of 30 years of fallen leaves, and I drove the car in slow over a track I could barely find, and the trees closed behind me, and I was on Hartwell land. The track ran maybe a quarter-mile back through the wild orchard before it opened into a clearing, and there the building stood. I stopped the car and got out and just looked, because there is a particular silence to a place that human beings made and then left, a silence that is different from the silence of woods that were never built on, and this clearing was full of it. There was the main building, long and low and built of fieldstone up to the windowsills and weathered board above, with a steep roof that had held, mostly, though one corner had let go and the sky showed through. There was a smaller building beside it, also stone, that I would learn was the press house. There was the skeleton of what had been a loading dock, and the rusted hulk of a flatbed truck grown round with weeds, and an old windmill, the kind that pumped water, its blades seized, and one of them hanging. And there were the apple trees, the close ones, the ones that had been the working orchard right around the buildings, and even gone wild and unpruned for 3 decades they were still trees, still alive, and a few of them, I saw, still bearing, the fruit small and spotted and dropping unharvested into the tall grass where it lay and rotted and filled the whole clearing with that smell. The smell from the cab of the truck when I was small. The smell of apples going to cider on their own, which is the smell of sweetness and time and a little bit of decay all at once. I want to tell you about the work of the next several days plainly, because the discovery did not happen in a single dramatic moment the way it does in stories, and I think the truth of it matters more than the drama would. It happened slowly, the way real things happen, through a great deal of dust and frustration and one false hope after another, and the fact that it happened at all was not luck. It was my grandfather having arranged it, decades in advance and again in his last months, so that a woman with the right ear would eventually stand in the right place and finally hear what he had left for her. The big iron key fit the main building. I knew the lock when I found it, exactly as the note had promised. A great old box lock on the main door, the keyhole shaped like a clover to match the head of the key, and when I worked the key into it the mechanism resisted and then turned with a sound like a cough, a deep iron sound that had not been made in 30 years. The door swung in. The smell came out to meet me, apples and old wood and the cold mineral smell of stone that has never been warm, and I stepped inside the place where 3 generations of my family had made the best cider in 3 counties. It was a cathedral of work. That is the only way I know to say it. The main room ran the full length of the building, and it was full of equipment. The great wooden vats ranged along one wall, taller than a man, their staves gray with age but sound, bound with iron hoops gone orange with rust but holding. There was a grinder, a scratter they called it, I would learn, a massive cast iron thing for breaking the apples down, and the press itself in the press house next door, a beam press of dark oak that must have weighed more than the truck outside. Its great screw threaded with a thread you could lay your finger in. Bottles, crates of them, dusty and intact. Barrels stacked to the ceiling along the back wall. Oak barrels, scores of them. And on every surface, on the workbench and the windowsills and pinned to the posts, the residue of the people who had worked here. A ledger left open as if someone meant to come back to it after lunch. A pair of leather gloves curled like dead hands. A calendar on the wall turned to a month 30 years gone. A tin cup, a child's drawing of an apple tree faded almost to nothing, taped to a beam at the height a small child could reach. At the height I could have reached, when I was small, in the cab of the truck. I worked through that building the way I had worked through the house. Methodically, a little afraid, taking the measure of it. And the first day, I found nothing but the equipment and the silence and the dust, which is to say I found a great deal, but nothing that explained the note, nothing I was meant to listen for. I drove back to the house on Sumner Road that night exhausted and filthy and turned over in my mind everything I had seen, and I came up against the same wall I had come up against in the lamplight. I did not have enough to know what I was looking for. You will know what to listen for. But I had walked the whole building and heard nothing but my own footsteps on the stone. The pressure I mentioned, the financial pressure, began that same week, and I will tell you about it because it is the part of these stories people sometimes leave out, and it is the part that makes everything else weigh what it weighs. Pruitt called me on the Wednesday. He had been to the courthouse. The news was bad and complicated in the way that bad news is always complicated when it involves a county records office and 60 years. The Cidery property, he had found, had indeed fallen off the active tax rolls, but not cleanly. Somewhere in the 70s, when the county computerized its records, the Vinton Road parcel had been misentered, its acreage attached by clerical error to the adjoining parcel, which belonged to a family named Copland, and the Coplands had been paying taxes on the combined acreage for decades without, very likely, ever knowing that some of the land they were paying on was not theirs. And here was the dangerous part. Because the Coplands had paid the taxes and, Pruitt suspected, had been running cattle or cutting timber on parts of it, there was a real chance they could make a claim of adverse possession, the legal doctrine by which a person who openly uses land for long enough can come to own it, regardless of what some old deed in a hymnal says. My grandfather's 1961 deed was good, but it had been silent for 60 years, and the law does not love silence. And there was now a question, a real one, about whether the Hartwell Cidery was mine, or the Coplands, or a thing the two families would spend years and more money than either had fighting over in a courthouse. And there were back taxes. Pruitt's best estimate, once the parcel was properly disentangled from the Copland land and reassessed, was that the Hartwell portion would carry a lien for unpaid taxes and penalties going back to the point of the original error, and the number he gave me, his careful conservative number, was just over $41,000. I did the bookkeeping in my head the way I do everything, automatically. I had, after the funeral expenses, perhaps $9,000 to my name. I had a small income. I had no way on earth to produce $41,000, and even if I could, I might be producing it to defend a property I would then lose to the Coplands anyway. The smart thing, the ledger-clean thing, the thing the woman who did the books for the heating and cooling company would have advised any client to do, was to walk away. Let the deed stay in the hymnal. Let the Coplands have the wild orchard and the rotting buildings. Take the house on Sumner Road, which was clean and clear in mine, and sell it, and go back to the city, and let the cidery be the thing it had been my whole life, a place I never knew existed. I want to be honest that I considered it. I sat in Ace's chair that night with Pruitt's numbers in front of me, and I considered walking away, and the reason I did not is not a noble one, or not only. It was the note. It was you will know what to listen for. Because if I walked away now, I would walk away not knowing, and I had spent 31 years not knowing things about my grandfather, and the not knowing had cost me everything, my last years with him, and I found that I could not bear to add one more thing to the list of what I had refused to learn about Asa Hartwell while I had the chance. The money said walk away. The years said stay and listen. I had spent my whole life letting the money decide. I decided, that night, to let the years decide instead, and I called Pruitt back and told him to file whatever needed filing to establish the Hartwell claim, and to do it quietly, and that I would find the $41,000 somehow. And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a different voice than his lawyer voice, that he thought Asa would be glad, and that he, Pruitt, had played in that cidery as a boy, and that the cider had been the best he ever tasted, and that he had wondered for 30 years what had become of the place. Royce found out I had been to the property. Of course he did. Marrow Creek is 1,800 people, and I had driven a car with city plates up the Vinton Road past the Copland place, and by the weekend Royce was on Ace's porch, and he had stopped pretending to be sorry. He stood in the doorway, and he said he understood I had been poking around the old place on the Vinton, and that I should know it had been a sore subject in the family for years, and that the land was as good as the Coplands now, and everybody knew it, and that I would only embarrass myself and waste the estate's money chasing a dead business that Asa himself had walked away from. He said, and this is the line that stayed with me, "You've been gone 31 years, Della. You don't get to come back and decide you know what's best for what's left. You weren't here. I was." And there was, again, that splinter of truth in it that I could not pull out. Because he had been here, he had mowed the yard and driven the old man to his appointments, and I had sent not one card. But underneath the truth was the want, the same want from the church basement, and I saw it clearly now. Royce did not care about the cidery. Royce wanted the house, and he had assumed the cidery was nothing. And now that I was spending time and the lawyer's hours on something out on the Vinton Road, he was afraid I had found something, and his fear made him cruel, and his cruelty made me certain. I told him the property was mine, by a deed older than his claim, and that any further conversation could go through Pruitt, and I closed the door, gently, while he was still talking. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The first real clue came on the second week, and it came because I finally did the thing the note had told me to do, which was to listen. I had been treating the cidery as a place to search with my eyes and my hands, the way I had searched the house, opening drawers and lifting tarps. But Asa had not written look. He had written listen. You will know what to listen for. And one gray afternoon, standing in the middle of that long stone room with the rain coming soft on the broken roof, I stopped searching and I just stood still, the way he had taught me to stand still in the choir loft before a piece began, to find the silence under the noise so you would know where to put the first note. And I closed my eyes, and I listened to the building. I heard the rain. I heard the wind moving through the gap in the roof. I heard a board ticking somewhere as the temperature changed. And then, under all of it, faint, so faint I thought at first I had imagined it, I heard a sound that did not belong to a wet roof and an empty building. It was a low sound, a resonance, almost too low to be a sound at all, more a thing you feel in the chest than hear with the ear, and it was coming from the back wall, from the wall of stacked oak barrels. I had a singer's ear, still, after all the years of not using it. It is the one thing I never lost, the ear, even after the voice went, and the ear told me that the wall of barrels was not a solid thing. It told me there was a space behind it. A room sings differently than a wall. Empty space behind stone has a tone, a hollowness the trained ear catches the way the eye catches a seam in wallpaper, and the back of that building, behind the barrels, was hollow, and Asa had known that I would be the one to hear it, because he had spent 15 years teaching me precisely the skill that would let me. I moved the barrels. There were 40 of them, oak, and most were empty and light, though a few in the bottom row were full of something and so heavy I could only roll them, and the rolling of them across the stone floor made a sound that filled the whole building. And it took me the rest of that day and into the next, my back screaming, my hands raw through the leather gloves I had taken from the workbench, the same gloves curled there for 30 years, my dead grandfather's gloves, and I wore them to move the barrels, and it felt like working beside him. And behind the barrels, when the last of the bottom row was rolled aside, was a wall, and the wall was not like the other walls. The other walls were fieldstone, rough and round. This wall was cut stone, ashlar, fitted close, the work of a mason and not a farmer, and set into it, almost invisible unless you knew to look, was the outline of a door. A stone door, hung on hidden iron, with no handle and no keyhole that I could see, and I stood in front of it in the lantern light, because the day had gone and I was working by a battery lantern now, and I understood that this was the thing. This was what I had been meant to find. Behind this fitted stone wall, behind a door my great-grandfather or his father had built into the back of a cider works for reasons I did not yet know, was the room my grandfather had wanted me, specifically me, to open. I could not find the way in that night. I ran my hands over every inch of the cut stone, looking for the catch, the seam, the loose stone that would be a lever, and I found nothing, and I was nearly weeping with frustration and exhaustion when I remembered the iron key, the clover-headed key that had opened the front door, still in my coat pocket. But there was no keyhole. I held the lantern close and went over the door frame stone by stone, and at last, low down, near the floor, on the right-hand jamb, I found it. Not a keyhole, but a slot, a thin vertical slot in the stone, and beside it, carved so shallow that 30 years of dust had nearly filled it, a clover. The same clover as the head of the key. I knelt on the cold stone and I slid the long shaft of the key into the slot, and it went into the head, and I turned it, and deep inside the wall something moved, a counterweight, a mechanism a mason had built into stone 100 years ago and oiled and balanced so well that even now, after all this time, when I put my shoulder to the door it swung inward, slow and smooth and silent, into the dark. I did not go in right away. I want to tell you that I did, that I rushed in, but I did not. I knelt there in the open doorway with the lantern beside me and the cold breath of that sealed room moving past my face, air that had not moved in 30 years and maybe far longer, and I was afraid. Not of what was inside. I was afraid of my grandfather. I was afraid of finally meeting the man who had built this and saved this and chosen me over it and never told me, the whole man, the one I had reduced for 31 years to a single cold morning in a kitchen. Because I knew, kneeling there, that whatever was through that door was going to be the truth of him, and the truth of him was going to require me to grieve all over again. Not the man who died in October, but the man I had refused to know for 3 decades, and grief like that is a debt that comes due all at once. So I knelt, and I breathed the cold air, and I let myself be afraid, and then I picked up the lantern and I went in. The room was small, smaller than I expected, perhaps 10 feet by 12, and it had been cut into the hillside behind the building so that 3 of its walls were living stone and only the front, the door wall, was built. It was dry. That was the first thing I understood, that it was bone dry, that whoever built it had built it to keep the damp out, with a floor sloped to a drain and the walls sealed somehow. And the dryness meant that everything inside it had been kept perfectly, the way the cold, dry dark keeps things, the way a cellar keeps apples through to spring. And it was full. Not crammed, not hoarded, but full in an arranged way, a kept way, shelves along the stone walls and a table in the center, and on every surface the things my family had thought worth sealing into a room behind a 100-pound stone door. I held the lantern up, and I turned slowly, and I let my eye move over it. There were barrels here too, but small ones, and labeled, and I understood from the labels that these were not ordinary cider, but something else, something aged, vintages marked by year in a hand that changed across the decades as one Hartwell handed the marking pen to the next. 1923, 1931, 1947, 1958. There were bottles in wooden racks, hundreds of them, dark glass sealed with wax, and the wax seals were stamped with the clover, and the next bore paper labels gone amber with age. There were ledgers, a whole shelf of them, the real ledgers, the business of 100 years kept in a row of cloth-bound books. There was a wooden case, the size of a small trunk, fitted with a brass lock, sitting in the center of the table as if it had been set there for me to find. And there was, on the wall facing the door, where the lantern light fell on at last, framed and protected behind glass, a photograph. I went to the photograph first. I do not know why. Perhaps because it was a face and the rest was objects, and I had come looking, underneath everything, for a face. It was old, sepia, a formal portrait of the kind people had made in the early part of the last century, and it showed a man standing in front of this very building, this cider works, when it was new, the stone freshly cut, the sign sharp and unweathered, Hartwell Cider Works, EST 1899, and the man stood with one hand resting easy on the door frame in the way of a man certain that the thing he is touching is his. And behind him, the orchard ran up the hill in clean-planted rows, heavy with fruit. And the man was not smiling exactly, but there was in his whole bearing a settledness, a rootedness, the look of a person standing in the exact place he is meant to stand. I did not know him. He was too old to be Asa, a generation or two back, my great-grandfather perhaps, or his father. But I knew the look on his face, because I had seen it once before, very recently, in another photograph, in my old bedroom on Sumner Road. It was the look Asa had worn watching me sing, the look of pride and belonging and certainty, and I understood that it was a Hartwell look, that it ran in us like the ear ran in us, and that my grandfather, taking down the choir robe photograph each year to dust it and hang it back, and keeping this sealed room with its 100 years of vintages and its founding portrait, had been doing the same thing both times, the only thing he had ever really known how to do, which was to keep, in silence, the things he could not bear to lose. I turned from the photograph to the table, to the wooden case with the brass lock, and I knew before I touched it that this was the heart of it, the thing the note had pointed at, the thing I was meant finally to hear. And I reached again into my coat for the iron key, because a key that opens a gate and a door might open a third thing, but the brass lock on the case was small, and the iron key was huge, and they were never meant for each other. And I knelt there in the lantern light of a room sealed for 30 years, holding a key that did not fit the last lock, with $41,000 of back taxes hanging over me, and a cousin who wanted me gone, and a deed that might not hold, and 31 lost. Years pressing down on the stone roof above my head, and I had no idea, yet, that the key to the case was hanging around my own neck, where I had put it without knowing what it was, in the locket I had found in my grandfather's desk, and worn out to the cidery every single day because it had felt, against my skin, like the one warm thing in all that cold and silence. The locket. I had found it the first night, in the Rolltop desk, in the same drawer as the hymnal, and I had not thought much of it because it had seemed a small thing beside a deed and a note. It was silver, tarnished nearly black, oval, with a worn pattern of apple leaves chased into the front, and when I had opened it that first night, there had been a photograph inside, tiny and faded, of a woman I took to be my grandmother, dead before I was born. I had clasped it around my neck almost without deciding to, the way you put on a thing that belonged to the dead because it is a way of letting them touch you again, and I had worn it every day out to the cidery without once thinking of it as anything but a comfort. But kneeling in that sealed room with the brass-locked case before me and the great iron key useless in my hand, I remembered the weight of it against my chest, and I lifted it out from under my collar and held it in the lantern light, and I looked at it properly for the first time. The back of the locket was not smooth. I had never turned it over. And on the back, when I did, there was a small protrusion, a stub of metal that I had taken for a clasp or a hinge, but was not either, and it was shaped, when I held it close to the lantern, like a tiny key, a flat brass key folded flush against the silver, hidden in plain sight as a thing pretending to be the back of a locket. My great-grandmother's locket, or my grandmother's, with the key to the family's heart folded into it and worn next to a Hartwell heart for who knows how many generations, passed down with the photograph, so that the key and the love had never once been separated. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work it free. The little brass key swung out on a hinge no bigger than a grain of rice. I fitted it to the lock on the wooden case. It turned. The lid came up. Inside, laid in fitted compartments lined with felt gone soft with age, were two things, and they were not what I expected, and they were exactly right. The first was money, but not the kind of money that solves a story cheaply. It was cash, old bills, banded, more than I had ever held, and I would count it later and find it was a little over $52,000, saved across decades, the smallest denominations the oldest, the bands themselves dated in Ace's hand. A few $100s set aside in good years and never spent. The Cider Works' true profit hidden away through the Depression and the war and the long, slow dying of the orchards. A family's patience turned into paper and kept dry behind stone. $52,000. I did the arithmetic before I could stop myself, the bookkeeper in me never sleeping. 41 for the taxes, 11 over. He had saved enough, almost to the dollar, to buy the land back from the silence that had swallowed it. He had not known what the lien would come to. He could not have. But he had saved everything he could against the day, and it was enough, and the enoughness of it was not luck. It was 60 years of a family declining to spend the thing they were keeping for someone who had not yet come. The second thing in the case was a letter and a small reel of tape, the old kind, quarter-inch on a plastic reel, in a cardboard box, and on the box in Ace's hand was written one word, Della. I read the letter there on the cold floor, and I am going to give you the part of it that matters, because the rest was instructions, the practical apparatus of a careful man, where the deed was registered and which courthouse drawer and Pruitt's name and number, the scaffolding he built so that the woman who found this would not be left alone with it. But under the scaffolding was the thing he had really come to say, and it was this. The cider in this room, he wrote, is not for selling, most of it, though some of it is worth a great deal to the right people, and you will need that, and you should let it go without grief. But the oldest barrels, the 1923 and the 1931, those are the ones my grandfather laid down. And there is a thing about cider that I want you to understand, because I think it is the truest thing I know, and I never found a way to tell you while you would still listen. Cider is just apples and time. That is all it is. You crush the fruit, and you wait. And the waiting is not nothing. The waiting is the whole of it. Because what is harsh becomes round, and what is raw becomes deep, and a thing that would make you sick in October becomes, by patience, in its own time and not before, the best thing 3 counties ever tasted. You cannot hurry it. You cannot fix a bad year by wanting it to be good. You can only keep it, and keep it carefully, and trust that time does to cider what time refuses to do to almost anything else, which is to make it better instead of worse. I let you go in silence. The letter went on, and then I let 30 years go by, and I told myself the whole time that I was keeping something, keeping my dignity, or keeping the peace, or keeping my half of a fight I could not even remember the start of. And the truth, Della, the truth I came to too late, is that I was not keeping anything. I was just letting it go bad. Silence is not cider. Time does not improve a thing you have sealed away in anger. It only hardens it. I sealed you away the way I sealed this room, and I told myself I was preserving something, and I was not. I was wasting it. I wasted 30 years that could have been the best of mine, the way the orchard wasted 30 years going wild. And the difference between the cider and the orchard and you is that the cider got better in the dark, and you and the orchard only got further away, and I am the one who shut all 3 doors. The cider was the only one of my keepings that time was kind to. The rest I have to ask you to forgive, knowing I have no right to ask, putting it on paper because I was too much a coward to put it in your ear while there was breath in me to say it and breath in you to hear. There is a tape in this box. It is you, singing, the Easter you were 22, the year before you left, recorded off the choir microphone without your knowing. I have listened to it more times than I will admit. It is the most beautiful thing this family ever made, and we have been making things for 100 years. I am sorry I let you stop. If you have stopped, and I think you have, I want you to find a way to start again. Not for me. I have no standing to ask anything for me. But because a voice like that belongs to the world, and the world is poorer by its silence, and so is every morning I spent not hearing it. You will know what to listen for. Listen to the tape. Then listen to yourself. The apples are still out there. They went wild, but they did not die. Neither did you. Neither, I hope, did the thing in you that sang. I do not have words for what that hour was, on the floor of that room, with the lantern and the letter and the little reel of tape that held my own voice from a year before I threw my life in a direction it did not want to go. I had come to Marrow Creek certain that my grandfather had let me go without caring, and I left that room certain of the opposite, that he had cared so much and so silently that the caring had calcified into the very silence I had mistaken for indifference, that the two of us had spent 31 years performing. The same wound from opposite sides, each believing the other had walked away, and that both of us had been wrong, and that only one of us was still alive to do anything about it. The grief of that is not the clean grief of loss. It is the grief of waste, which is worse, and his letter had named it exactly. We had let something go bad in the dark that we had each told ourselves we were keeping. I carried the case out of the room, and I did not seal the door behind me. I left it open. The room had been sealed long enough. What happened after went the way careful things go, which is to say slowly and without much drama, and I am glad of that, because the drama was never the point. I took the money to Pruitt, and we did it properly, documented and deposited, and Pruitt's face when I told him what was in the case in the room behind the barrels was a thing I will keep. He took the Cidery claim, and he ran at it with the energy of a man avenging his own boyhood, and the adverse possession threat from the Coplans, which had loomed so large, came apart faster than anyone expected, because it turned out the Coplans had never known the disputed acreage was on their tax bill, had never used the Cidery land at all, had run their cattle only on their own ground. And when old Marvin Copland understood the situation, he did a thing that I have come to think is the truest measure of a place like Marrow Creek. He drove out to Sumner Road, and he sat on the porch with me, and he said he had been a boy when the Hartwell Cider Works closed, and he had grieved it. The whole valley had grieved it, and that he would sign whatever needed signing to put that land back where it belonged, and that the only thing he wanted in return was a bottle of whatever I found in there, if any of it was still good. We settled it in an afternoon, the two of us and Pruitt, the kind of settlement that does not happen in cities, and the deed held, and the back taxes were paid out of the money in the case with $11,000 to spare, and 22 acres on the old Vinton Road, with a cider works on them that had been making the best cider in 3 counties since 1899, were mine, free and clear, in my own name, by my grandfather's hand. The appraisal was its own astonishment. Pruitt knew a man, a specialist out of the city who dealt in heritage food and drink for collectors and museums and the auction houses that have sprung up around such things. A careful, unhurried man named Okafor, who came out to the cidery with white gloves and a case of instruments, and spent 2 full days in the sealed room. The equipment alone, he told me, the beam press and the cast iron scratter and the great vats, was worth a serious sum to the right buyer, the restaurants and the heritage operations that pay well for authentic working antiques of the trade. But it was the cider that made him quiet. The aged vintages in the sealed room, the bottles under wax, the oldest barrels, were, he said, a thing he had heard of in the trade as a rumor and never expected to stand in front of. An unbroken century of a single family's craft, perfectly cellared, the dry stone room having done by accident what the great cellars of the world do on purpose, held the stuff at an even cool through every summer and winter for 100 years. There was a market for it, he said, a small and serious and well-funded market, collectors and historians, and a certain kind of restaurant that would pay for a single bottle of pre-depression farmhouse cider what I had once made in a month. He gave me a range. The conservative end of it, the number he said he would put his name to without hesitation, was the kind of number that does not change the shape of a life into something unrecognizable, but changes the pressure of it entirely, that turns the next several decisions from things made out of fear into things made out of choice. The high end was higher. He warned me, the way honest appraisers do, that the market for such things is real but slow, that it would take patience to realize the value, that I should sell carefully, a few bottles at a time, to the right buyers, never in a hurry. A few bottles at a time, carefully, to the right buyers, never in a hurry. I sat with Okafor's report at the kitchen table on Sumner Road, and I laughed, alone, until I nearly cried, because of course that was the instruction, of course it was, It was the same instruction the whole story had been giving me from the start. The instruction folded into a hymnal and carved into a clover and aged into a barrel. You cannot hurry it. You can only keep it carefully and trust the time. My grandfather had not left me a windfall. He had left me a discipline. He had left me the family trade, which was patience, and 100 years of evidence that it worked. Royce came one last time. I had been dreading it, the confrontation, the scene, and it did not go the way I had braced for. He had heard, the way the whole town had heard, and he stood in the doorway of the house he had wanted, the house that was mine, and the one had gone out of him and left something smaller and more honest in its place. He said he supposed I would be selling the house now and going back to the city, with the cidery worth what folks were saying. And I told him the truth, which surprised us both, that I was not selling the house, that I was not going back, that I was going to stay in Marrow Creek and bring the orchard back and make cider on the Vinton Road the way Hartwell's had done for 100 years, and that I would need help. More help than one woman who left at 24 and had spent 30 years doing the books for a heating and cooling company could possibly provide, and that he, Royce, had stayed and knew the valley and knew the families and had mowed that old man's yard for 10 years when I was sending not even a card, and that there was a job out on the Vinton Road for a man who knew how to stay if he wanted it. I did not say it to be gracious. I want to be clear about that, because the channel this story lives on likes grace, and grace is real, but it is not the whole of it. I said it because it was true that I needed him, and because I had spent 31 years learning what silence does to a family, and because I was not going to seal one more door in anger, not even against the cousin who had wanted me gone. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he took his cap off, which I had never once seen him do, and he said he would think about it, and the next morning his truck was in the cidery lot at 7 o'clock, and he has not missed many mornings since. I listened to the tape last. I had been afraid to. Pruitt found a man with the right machine, and one evening I sat alone in the front room of the house on Sumner Road, in Ace's chair, with the reel turning, and I heard the choir come up first, the old hymn, and then under it, and then over it a voice I did not recognize, and then did, my own voice at 22. Before the auditions, and the almost good enough, and the wedding bands, and the front desk woman, and the 30 years of deciding to be something else, a voice with no fear in it yet. A voice that believed it belonged to the world, filling the little church on Bell Street, and, somewhere in the back, picked up faint on the choir microphone, the sound of one old woman beginning to cry. And I sat in my dead grandfather's chair, and I let the tape play to the end, and when it was over I did a thing I had not done in front of any living soul in 20 years. I sang, quietly, badly, my voice a gravel road now, and the high notes gone where the high notes go, the hymn from the tape, alone in the lamplight. And it was not beautiful, and it did not matter that it was not beautiful, because it was not silent. And after 31 years of letting the best thing in me go bad in the dark, I had finally understood the difference, the only difference that ever mattered, between a thing you are keeping and a thing you have merely sealed away. That was 3 years ago. The cidery on the old Vinton Road is working again. We pruned the wild orchard back over 2 hard winters, Royce and I and a few others, the trees that had gone feral but not died, and the first true harvest off the rehabilitated rows pressed last fall, and the first new Hartwell cider in 30 years is in the barrels now, doing what cider does, which is taking its time. I sell the old vintages the way Okafor said to, a few bottles at a time, to the right people, never in a hurry, and each bottle I let go pays for another season of bringing the place back. And I have come to love the slowness of it, the way it refuses to be rushed, the way it insists that I keep showing up. Marvin Copland got his bottle, the 1947, and he sent back a note that said only that he had wept, and that his father would have wept, and that the valley had its heart back. I did not get the years back. I want to say that plainly, because the truest thing in my grandfather's letter was the thing he refused to pretend about, and I will not pretend either. 31 years are gone, his and mine, the years we did not have, the visits we did not make, the songs he did not hear, and the wisdom he did not get to hand me across a kitchen table while there was still breath for it. No cidery and no fortune and no sealed room full of a century's patience can give back a single one of those mornings. Tom does not run backward, not for apples and not for people. But I have learned the other thing the cider knows, the thing it took me 55 years and a dead man's letter to hear, that while you cannot get the years back, you can sometimes redeem what they were for. The years Asa spent in silence, hoarding his love behind stone, were wasted, and he knew it, and he said so. But the years before that, the 100 years of Hartwell's crushing fruit and trusting time, and the 15 years he spent teaching a small girl to find the silence under the noise so she would know where to put the first note, those years were not wasted, because they reached across all the wasted ones and put exactly the right woman in exactly the right room with exactly the right ear to hear the hollow behind the wall. He could not give me back the lost years, but he gave them a meaning they would not otherwise have had, and that, I have come to believe, is the most that any of us can do with the time we did not get to keep. Not recover it, but redeem it, turn it, late and imperfectly and with grief still in it, into something that finally tastes the way the keeping always promised it would. The locket is around my neck as I tell you this, the little brass key folded against the silver, the photograph of the woman whose name I now know inside it. I wear it out to the cidery every day, and on the wall of the sealed room, which is not sealed anymore, which is just a cool dry cellar now where the oldest barrels rest, the founding portrait still hangs, the Hartwell standing with his hand easy on the door frame, certain of the thing he is touching, and beside it I have hung 2 photographs of my own. One is the old picture of me at 22 in the choir robe, mouth open, and Asa at the organ with his head turned to watch, and on his face the pride he never said. And the other is new. It is me, last autumn, in front of the cider works with the orchard pruned and bearing behind me and Royce just out of frame, and I am standing with one hand resting easy on the door frame, the Hartwell way, certain at last of the thing I am touching, and I am not smiling exactly. But there is in my whole bearing a settledness, a rootedness, the look of a person standing in the exact place she was always meant to stand, and finally, only 31 years late, did. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.